The HOA thought they'd struck gold by building 96 dream homes. What they didn't know was that the true owner of the land was waiting, and they just walked straight into her trap. Imagine waking up one morning, looking out your window, and realizing the land your family has protected for generations is now covered in brand new houses. Houses you never gave anyone permission to build. That's exactly what happened to Marjorie Whitfield, a 62-year-old retired school administrator in suburban Georgia. To Marjorie, the land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was history, nearly 40 acres her parents had worked hard to pay off, piece by piece, reminding her as a child, "Land is the one thing they can't make more of." She remembered running barefoot through those fields, chasing fireflies at dusk, and listening to her father's voice, a steady promise that this land would always be hers to keep. So, even as developers circled and neighbors sold off their plots, Marjorie held her ground. Most people overlooked the property. It sat on the edge of a growing suburb just outside Macon, Georgia, a place where chain stores were popping up, but plenty of fields still sat untouched. Developers saw her acreage as a nuisance. Too many trees, uneven patches, stubborn clay soil. But to Marjorie, it was priceless. And unlike many who inherit land, she didn't neglect it. She paid her taxes on time, every year. She kept every document locked in a fireproof safe. She even had her attorney friend, Samuel Drake, review the title every few years. Just in case. "Marjorie, you've got yourself a fortress here," Samuel told her one evening at her kitchen table. She smiled politely, but she wasn't naive. She knew how the world worked, and how easily money and power could try to erase what's rightfully yours. People with money often believed they could bend the rules. Marjorie Whitfield wasn't about to give them that opening. That's why it stunned her, one sweltering summer afternoon, to drive down a back road near her property and see a bulldozer tearing into the earth. At first, she brushed it off, probably county work, maybe utility maintenance or road repairs. But a week later, when she drove past again, her stomach dropped. Neat rows of survey stakes dotted her land, and construction crews were pouring concrete like they owned the place. Marjorie pulled her car to the shoulder, waved down a worker in a neon vest, and asked, "Excuse me, what's going on here?" "New subdivision, ma'am," he said, barely glancing up. "Lakewood Meadows. 90-something homes going up. Gonna be beautiful. 90 homes. On her land." At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. Surely someone had double-checked the records. Surely no professional developer would just assume land was free for the taking. But as the weeks passed, frames went up. Then rooftops. Then siding. Every few days, she'd drive by and watch strangers lay claim to the ground her family had protected for generations. When she told friends at church, some didn't even believe her. "They can't just build without asking," one woman said. Marjorie said nothing. She simply opened her yellowed folder, deeds, tax receipts, maps dating back to the 1950s, and placed it on the table. "They didn't ask," she said quietly. "And they didn't check." What she didn't yet know was that the Lakewood Meadows HOA, working hand in glove with a regional builder, had relied on decades-old clerical records that mislabeled her 40 acres as unclaimed. To them, her land looked like an empty canvas, waiting to be built on. But to Marjorie, it was a legacy. As the homes sold, for sale, signs vanished almost overnight. Moving trucks rolled in. Families hung curtains and kids rode bikes on freshly paved cul-de-sacs. The HOA president, Clifford Myers, boasted to the local paper about building the crown jewel of the county, smiling for ribbon-cutting photos and talking about community pride. But a storm was brewing. Because while Clifford was celebrating, one woman sat quietly in her modest ranch house a mile away. The same woman who had paid taxes on that land every year, without fail, for 4 decades. Marjorie wasn't furious. She was focused. Each evening, she sat at her dining room table, spreading out her documents, circling dates, drafting letters with her attorney, Samuel Drake. She didn't shout. She didn't protest. She planned. Because she knew what the HOA didn't. Once the courts saw her airtight records, there would be no question. Those homes weren't theirs. They were sitting squarely on her property. And to Marjorie, the question was never if she'd win. It was how high the price of that victory would be. Marjorie Whitfield never left her land to chance. Every spring, she'd drive into downtown Macon to review the property tax records in person. The clerks all knew her by name. "Mrs. Whitfield, you're one of the few who still comes in," one teased once. Marjorie just smiled. "That's because I don't like surprises." Her philosophy was simple. If you protect what's yours, you never have to beg to get it back. While neighbors around her lost acres to foreclosure or shady deals, Marjorie stood firm. Her parents' voices were always in her ear. Each spring, she'd walk the boundary lines, sometimes with her cousin Thomas, who still lived nearby. They'd carry a thermos of sweet tea, stroll past the pine trees, and note what fences needed fixing. "Still yours, Marge," Thomas would say, tapping one of the old iron markers buried near the corner. "Ain't nobody taking this from the white fields." But Marjorie didn't trust words. She trusted paperwork, signatures, dates, evidence. That's why, 3 years before a single bulldozer ever touched her soil, she sat across from attorney Samuel Drayton in his office off Spring Street. "I keep hearing chatter about survey disputes," she told him, sliding a folder across his desk. "Developers are circling this county like hawks. I need to make sure my land can't be touched." Samuel flipped through the folder, eyebrows raised. "Marjorie, this is better than most courthouses keep. You've got receipts, maps, even your daddy's handwritten notes." "I've been ready since '88, she replied dryly. Together, they combed line by line through her deed chain, verifying nothing had been sold, transferred, or even leaned against. Samuel updated her will and filed a quiet title action, locking her ownership in the court record. "Belt and suspenders lawyering," he called it. That belt and suspenders approach would turn out to be the very thing that saved her. When Lakewood Meadows crossed her boundary, there was already a clear, court-recognized paper trail with her name on it. Meanwhile, the HOA leadership, people like Clifford Myers, the sharp-tongued president, barely noticed her. They drove past her modest ranch home without a second thought. To them, she was just another retiree with too much grass to mow. They couldn't have been more wrong. One afternoon, Samuel sat across from her dining room table, maps and deeds spread out between them. "They'll probably argue ignorance," he said. "Say it was a mistake. Some oversight in the county files." Marjorie stirred sugar into her tea. "Ignorance doesn't move a bulldozer," she said flatly. Samuel leaned back, weighing his words. "You understand what this means, right? Once these families move in, the stakes get higher. This isn't just about money. People will see you as the villain, even though you're the rightful owner. I've been painted worse," she said evenly. "They'll see the truth in court." Her calm unnerved even him. It wasn't the calm of someone disengaged. It was the stillness of a woman sharpening her sword before battle. As construction ramped up, Marjorie didn't scream or protest. She documented. She photographed every stage from public roads. She marked down dates, even shot video as trucks poured concrete and sold signs went up. Every piece of evidence went into a binder labeled Lakewood Meadows, in neat block letters. Her cousin Thomas asked once why she wasn't making a scene. "Why not call the local news? Chain yourself to a tree?" "Because they expect noise," she replied. "Noise fades. Paperwork doesn't." With every week that passed, her case grew stronger. The irony was brutal. While the HOA toasted their success, the quiet retiree they had dismissed had already laid the groundwork to dismantle them. Her property taxes were current to the penny. Her title had been reaffirmed by a judge. Her lawyer was briefed. Her evidence binder could have doubled as a construction log. The trap wasn't built overnight. It was crafted slowly, deliberately, over decades of vigilance. The Lakewood Meadows HOA thought they had secured the land of opportunity. In reality, they had built their suburban dreams straight into someone else's fortress. They weren't just selling homes. They were selling status, community, The illusion that moving to Lakewood Meadows meant you'd finally made it. And no one pushed that dream harder than Clifford Myers, the HOA president. Clifford was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, salt and pepper hair, the kind of man who could charm a developer over lunch and leave with a handshake deal. He'd built his reputation on getting things done, even if it meant cutting corners. "We're not just building houses," he told the local paper during a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Cameras flashed, and polite applause filled the air. "We're building a legacy neighborhood, something people will remember as a model of progress." Behind the scenes, Clifford and his board were already cutting deals with Hanover Construction, a mid-sized builder eager to expand in Bibb County. The pitch was simple: double the size of Lakewood Meadows by claiming a wide stretch of land that, on outdated county maps, appeared unclaimed. No one bothered to check ownership. During a planning meeting, a junior project manager at Hanover flipped through faded plats. Parcel 1467 still shows a name. Whitfield," he said. Clifford waved it off. "Paperwork error. Probably some old farm long gone. We'll clear it up after the build." That was Clifford's style: start fast, fix later. And his confidence infected the entire board. To them, paperwork was a technicality, something lawyers could smooth over once the houses were sold and families had moved in. After all, who in their right mind would dare stand against 96 brand new homes filled with families? But for Clifford, this wasn't just about housing. It was about power and money. A bigger community meant higher HOA dues, more influence, and his name etched into the county's growth story. Local banks lined up to finance the expansion. Real estate agents hyped Phase 2 as the hottest buy in central Georgia. Hanover ran construction crews 6 days a week to stay on schedule. From the outside, it looked unstoppable. Bulldozers leveled trees. Surveyors pounded stakes. Foundations sprouted like teeth across the land. Even the mayor dropped by to shake Clifford's hand and pose for photos beside the first framed house. At neighborhood meetings, Clifford sold the dream with rehearsed confidence. "Folks, this expansion is going to skyrocket property values," he said, tapping at a PowerPoint slide. "Better schools, closer retail, a safer, stronger community. Lakewood Meadows is about to be the place to live in central Georgia." Homeowners cheered. They trusted him. They trusted the process. But beneath the glossy pitch, cracks were forming, not in the homes, which were sturdy enough, but in the foundation of the deal itself. Contractors whispered about inconsistencies in the land records. A Hanover accountant flagged a quiet discrepancy in the acreage. And a county clerk, almost offhandedly, mentioned to a board member that the name, Whitfield, still popped up in the database. Instead of slowing down, Clifford doubled down. "If we pump the brakes, we lose momentum," Clifford told his board. "Momentum is everything. Families are ready to buy, and we're not about to scare them with technicalities." His words carried weight. By fall, half the homes were under contract. By winter, moving trucks lined the streets. Sofas and flat-screen TVs were unloaded, kids raced bikes down brand-new driveways, and holiday wreaths hung proudly on fresh painted doors. To the families, it was paradise. To the HOA board, it was proof of their genius. But ambition has a way of blinding people. Inside the boardroom, they believed they were untouchable, too big to fail. And if ownership questions ever surfaced? Easy. A quiet payout here, a discreet settlement there. After all, what retiree would dare go up against their machine? At one HOA mixer, Clifford raised a plastic cup of wine and grinned. "Land's land," he chuckled. "Half the time it's tied up in red tape. We just cut through it. That's how you make progress." Some laughed uncomfortably. Others admired his boldness. What none of them saw, what Clifford refused to see, was that his progress had already set a trap. Because just a mile away, Marjorie Whitfield sat at her dining room table with her evidence binder open, documenting everything. To Clifford, she was invisible. To Marjorie, he was writing the opening chapter of his downfall. And Clifford's recklessness wasn't just going to cost him. It was about to drag 96 unsuspecting families into a nightmare they never saw coming. By the time the first houses in Lakewood Meadows were halfway built, Marjorie's casual curiosity had hardened into precision. Now, when she drove by, her phone was in her hand. Lot 12, framing completed, she whispered into the microphone. Lot 14, roof installed. It wasn't nostalgia. It was evidence. Still, the audacity stunned her. One afternoon, standing in her kitchen, she told her cousin Thomas, "I can't believe they just plowed right over my land, like I was invisible." Thomas shook his head. "They think money makes them bulletproof. But you've got the law on your side. Don't let them scare you." But intimidation came quickly. The first sign was a glossy flyer left in her mailbox. Lakewood Meadows expansion. Homes starting at $299,000. She stared at the map on the back, recognizing every inch of her own land. The audacity made her laugh, a short, bitter sound. At her next meeting with her attorney, Samuel Drayton, she slid the flyer across the desk. "They're not hiding what they're doing," he muttered, frowning. "They're daring you to challenge it." "And that's exactly what I'm going to do," Marjorie replied. Then came the whispers. In the grocery store parking lot, her neighbor Glenda Barnes approached. "You seen what they're building?" "Seen it," Marjorie said, voice sharp. "And it's mine." "Yours? What do you mean?" "That land, that's my inheritance. They just didn't bother to check." Soon, the whispers turned into chatter. At church, a woman asked if it was true she was suing the subdivision. A deacon told her she should just take the money and walk away. But Marjorie wasn't looking for fast cash. She wanted justice. Her first official step was quiet but firm, a cease and desist letter, drafted by Samuel, delivered to the HOA on a Friday morning. When Clifford read it, he smirked and tossed it onto the table. "This woman thinks she's going to scare us with paperwork." He laughed. "We'll see about that." What Clifford didn't realize was that the woman he dismissed had already built a case that could dismantle everything he'd created. "She doesn't have the resources to fight us," Clifford scoffed, tossing Marjorie's cease and desist letter onto the table. To him, it was nothing but empty bluster. But Marjorie wasn't bluffing. Within weeks, Samuel filed suit, a meticulously crafted complaint that landed on the HOA's desk like a sledgehammer. Every detail was there: property deeds, tax receipts, boundary maps, even probate records showing the land's transfer decades earlier. Clifford still waved it off. "It'll get tossed," he assured Hanover Construction during their next meeting. "These cases always do." What he didn't understand, what no one in that boardroom understood, was that Marjorie wasn't some panicked retiree flailing in desperation. She had prepared for this battle years before they ever broke ground. Meanwhile, families were moving in. Moving trucks rumbled through the streets. Kids unpacked bikes. Parents planted flowers in fresh mulch beds. They had no idea their dream homes were built on a fault line that could split open at any moment. Victor Ramirez remembered overhearing two construction workers arguing near his driveway one afternoon. "I'm telling you," one muttered, "this land isn't clean. There's still a Whitfield name on the file." The other shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Houses are sold already." Victor brushed it off then. But those words would come back to haunt him. At Marjorie's house, the tension grew heavier by the day. She and Samuel met almost daily, poring over every letter from the HOA's attorneys. Their argument wasn't that the land wasn't hers. They couldn't deny that. Instead, they tried to claim her rights were outdated, that she hadn't actively used the property. Samuel smirked when he read it. "They're desperate. That won't hold." But Marjorie knew better. "They're going to paint me like I'm heartless," she said quietly one evening. "Like I want to throw families out on the street. And you need to be ready for that," Samuel warned. "This isn't just law. It's optics." She was ready. Ready for the whispers in church pews. Ready for the cold stares in the grocery store. Ready for the pressure to just take the money. She hadn't spent her life protecting her family's land just to hand it over to people who thought rules didn't apply to them. By early spring, Lakewood Meadows looked like something out of a real estate brochure. Cul-de-sacs were paved. Streetlights glowed at dusk. Trucks unloaded furniture nearly every weekend. Families unloaded boxes, kids laughed in driveways, golden retrievers sniffed at freshly laid sod. On the surface, it was the American dream. Beneath it, a storm was brewing. The Ramirez family was the first to move in. Victor and his wife, Angela, had saved for years, pinching every dollar to afford their first real home. When they toured the model house, Angela fell in love with the kitchen. "This is where we'll host Thanksgiving," she whispered, her hand gliding across the granite counters. Victor signed the contract with pride, believing they'd finally secured stability for their children. They weren't alone. Lauren and Tyler Briggs, a young couple from Warner Robins, bought a 3-bedroom near the edge of the development. For them, it was an escape from a cramped apartment. "We finally have a backyard," Tyler said, tossing a stick for their dog while Lauren painted a nursery for their baby due in July. Darnell and Monica Price, a retired postal worker and his wife, saw their purchase as a reward for decades of hard labor. "This is where we'll grow old together," Monica told her sister over the phone. "We finally found peace." The HOA celebrated each closing with quiet confidence. At every board meeting, Clifford updated the room. "We're 80% sold already," he boasted. "This community is a model for the region." Applause followed. Glasses clinked. No one dared question him. But not every new homeowner felt at ease. Rumors trickled through the subdivision, whispers about a woman claiming to own the land beneath their homes. At a block party, one neighbor scoffed. "Scare tactics," he said. "People always come out of the woodwork when money's involved." But others weren't so sure. Some residents received legal notices, delivered by Samuel, informing them of the pending lawsuit. One morning, Angela Ramirez found one taped to their front door. She handed it to Victor, her hands shaking. "Is this real?" Victor read it twice, his stomach sinking. "It can't be. They wouldn't sell us a house on land they don't own." But deep down, he knew something was very, very wrong. And on Sunday afternoons, Marjorie would drive slowly through the subdivision, past the streets now named for trees that had once grown there. She'd watch children ride bikes where she used to chase fireflies. Her land, now covered in vinyl siding and mailboxes. Marjorie felt no joy, only a deeper resolve. She didn't hate the families moving into Lakewood Meadows. In truth, she pitied them. They were victims of someone else's arrogance. But they weren't her responsibility. The mess belonged to the HOA and Hanover Construction. At homeowner gatherings, the tension was starting to show. One evening, Clifford stood at the front of the clubhouse, wearing his usual confident grin. "I want to put your minds at ease," he said, his voice smooth. "Yes, there's a woman making claims about the property, but our attorneys assure us there's no merit. You have nothing to worry about." From the back, a man raised his hand. "But what if she wins?" "She won't," Clifford shot back, his smile tightening. "And even if she tries, the county won't let 90 families lose their homes. Trust me, we're solid." Some residents exhaled in relief. Others weren't so easily convinced. A few started searching Marjorie Whitfield online. What they found rattled them. Decades of tax records, probate filings, even old newspaper clippings with her family proudly standing on the same land their homes now occupied. It sank in. This wasn't some random woman causing trouble. This was the rightful owner. At the Ramirez house, Angela sat at the kitchen table one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if everything we've worked for disappears? What if we're squatting and don't even know it?" Victor clenched his jaw. "I'll fight before I let that happen. But if this is true, then we bought into a lie." By summer, Lakewood Meadows looked alive on the surface. Kids chasing sprinklers, mail carriers making their rounds, lawnmowers buzzing on Saturdays. But beneath the cheer was a quiet dread. Homeowners began to wonder if the ground under their feet was really theirs at all. For Marjorie, every sold sign she passed only strengthened her case. The more homes they built, the costlier the mistake, and she had the paper trail to prove it. Every deed, every map, every tax receipt. And as families unpacked their boxes and Clifford smoothed over concerns, the lawsuit gathered speed. Soon, no one would be able to pretend the land was theirs. The wake-up call came the day the first homeowner received a legal notice. That was the moment the HOA realized Marjorie Whitfield wasn't bluffing. She was coming for them. And she wasn't coming alone. Samuel Drayton filed the lawsuit in Bibb County Superior Court, attaching nearly 40 years of property records, a meticulous timeline of stewardship no judge could ignore. Marjorie didn't celebrate. She didn't storm the HOA office or plaster signs across her yard. She moved quietly, deliberately, as if she'd been rehearsing for this moment her entire life. One evening, she and Samuel sat at her dining table, the HOA's first legal response spread between them, a thick packet filled with dismissals and technicalities. "They're leaning on one thing," Samuel said, flipping through the pages. "They're trying to argue you abandoned the land." Marjorie arched an eyebrow. "Abandoned? I paid those taxes every single year, while they were throwing parties." Samuel smirked, holding up her stack of receipts. "This right here will shred their argument." And as word of the lawsuit spread through Lakewood Meadows, so did a new, undeniable reality. The quiet woman the HOA had ignored was no longer in the background. She was the storm, and it was closing in. At first, most people brushed it off as gossip, an exaggerated rumor meant to stir fear. Then the letters started arriving. Plain envelopes addressed to occupant, warning that their homes might be subject to future legal action. Panic began to bubble beneath the polished surface of Lakewood Meadows. One afternoon, Angela Ramirez found Marjorie's number online and called. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not against you, but what does this mean for us? Are we going to lose our home?" Marjorie's tone was steady, calm. "Angela, you should never have been put in this position," she said softly. "I don't want to hurt families, but I can't let the HOA steal from me. This fight isn't with you, it's with them." Angela exhaled shakily. "I believe you. I just don't know how we'll survive if this all falls apart." As more homeowners learned the truth, pressure mounted on Clifford Myers and his board. At an HOA meeting, the tension finally broke. "You told us everything was fine," one man shouted. Clifford raised his hands, his voice sharp. "It is fine. This is one woman trying to extort us. She has the deeds," another resident yelled. "I looked them up myself." The room erupted. And for the first time, Clifford's confident grin faltered. Behind closed doors, Hanover Construction was growing restless. Their legal team warned Clifford, if Marjorie's claim held, every home they built could be tied up in court. Investors started pulling back. Realtors grew quiet. The Golden Project was starting to rot from the inside. Meanwhile, Marjorie felt nothing but quiet determination. For decades, people had underestimated her, because she kept to herself, because she wasn't loud. But Marjorie knew something about power. Real power doesn't shout. It builds quietly, until it can't be ignored. "Stay measured," Samuel reminded her during one of their strategy sessions. "You're winning this on paper. Don't get dragged into theatrics." She smiled faintly. "I don't need theatrics. I just need the truth." But the pressure was mounting. Anonymous letters began appearing in her mailbox. "You're ruining families. Drop the case. You'll regret this." She showed them to Samuel. He frowned but stayed calm. "This is their fear talking," he said. "And fear means we're closing in." At church, some people stopped sitting in her pew. Others whispered that she was greedy. Heartless. She prayed quietly, holding her head high. If they only knew the whole story, she thought. What kept her steady was her parents' voices, the memory of her father's long shifts at the mill, of her mother stretching pennies to keep the taxes paid. To let that sacrifice be erased by arrogance was unthinkable. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about legacy, respect, and refusing to stay silent when everyone expected her to. The HOA doubled down, hiring a high-powered law firm out of Atlanta. Clifford gave interviews to the local news, painting Marjorie as unreasonable. "We've offered her compensation," he said smoothly. "We're trying to protect families from being displaced, but she won't compromise." Marjorie watched the clip on TV and shook her head. "Compensation?" she muttered. "They never offered me a dime." The lies didn't rattle her. They steeled her resolve. She'd spent her life teaching children that honesty mattered, that actions had consequences. Now it was her turn to prove it. By the time the case reached Bibb County Superior Court, the entire county was talking. Local papers ran bold headlines. "Land dispute puts subdivision at risk. 96 homes in legal limbo." Coffee shops buzzed. Barbershops whispered. Everyone wanted to know if a quiet, retired school administrator could really bring down an entire homeowners association. The courtroom was packed. Families from Lakewood Meadows filled the benches, clutching mortgage paperwork as if it could protect them. Realtors, bankers, even county officials crowded the aisles. At the center of it all sat Marjorie Whitfield. She wore a simple navy dress. On the table beside her, a neatly organized manila folder. Her face was calm, but inside her chest, her heart pounded. She glanced across the aisle at Clifford Myers, the man who had treated her legacy like it was disposable. And she knew, this was the moment the quiet storm she'd built was about to break wide open. Clifford leaned back in his chair, whispering to his attorneys in their tailored suits. The smirk on his face said it all. He still believed he could spin this his way. The gavel cracked. "This court will now hear arguments in Whitfield versus Lakewood Meadows HOA and Hanover Construction," Judge Patricia Long announced, her voice slicing through the tense silence. Samuel rose, his voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Whitfield, has maintained continuous, documented ownership of this land for over 40 years. She paid every tax bill. She upheld every obligation. And yet, without her consent, without even verifying ownership, the defendants built an entire subdivision on her property. This," Samuel said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "is not speculation. This is theft." The words lingered like a storm cloud. Homeowners shifted in their seats, some bowed their heads, whispering quiet prayers. When the HOA's lead attorney stood, the tone shifted. "Your Honor, while we respect Mrs. Whitfield's claims, this land has been improved. 96 families now reside there. To grant her full control would cause irreparable harm to innocent homeowners. This lawsuit, we submit, seeks a windfall at the expense of hardworking families." Marjorie's jaw tightened, but Samuel leaned toward her, voice low. "Let him talk," he whispered. The more he leans on sympathy, the weaker his legal footing. Witness after witness took the stand. County clerks confirmed that Marjorie's taxes had been paid every single year. Surveyors testified that the subdivision's boundaries had indeed bled deep into her parcel. Samuel laid out photos, maps, and certified deeds like a surgeon, each piece sliding perfectly into the puzzle of her ownership. Then, it was Marjorie's turn. The room went still as she took the stand. Her voice was calm, steady, no anger, just conviction. "My parents worked themselves to the bone to buy that land," she said quietly. "They told me to protect it. And I have. I didn't build those houses. I didn't invite those families there. The HOA and the builders made that choice. Now they want to make me the villain for standing up for what's mine." Some homeowners shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, they didn't see her as a faceless adversary. They saw her as someone wronged, someone who had every right to fight back. Clifford, however, was unraveling. When it was his turn on the stand, the bravado faded. "Mr. Myers," Samuel began, his tone sharp. "Did you verify ownership before building on parcel 1467? "We relied on our partners," Clifford stammered, a bead of sweat tracing his temple. "So you didn't check?" "We trusted the information available," Clifford insisted. Samuel stepped closer. "Trusted, or ignored?" A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clifford's face flushed crimson. During recess, the tension followed everyone into the hallways. Angela Ramirez approached Marjorie, her hands twisting nervously. "I don't know what's going to happen," she admitted, voice trembling. Marjorie met her gaze, calm and steady as ever. "Neither do I," she said softly. "But I do know this. The truth has a way of winning." Angela's voice trembled as she whispered, "I just want you to know. I understand why you're fighting. This isn't fair to you either." Marjorie rested a hand gently on her arm. "I don't blame you, Angela," she said softly. "You were sold a dream that was never theirs to sell." By the second week of testimony, the momentum had shifted. Every expert reinforced her ownership. Every document pointed back to her name. The HOA's arguments grew thinner by the day, less about the law, more about optics, and everyone in the courtroom felt it. For the families, though, the pressure was unbearable. Some wept quietly in the pews, realizing their mortgages might collapse. Others glared at Clifford Myers with a fury that could burn through walls, as if they'd finally seen the man who had conned them. The final day of arguments was electric. Samuel stood tall, his voice ringing through the chamber. "Your Honor, this is not simply a legal case, it's a moral one. The defendants gambled with land that wasn't theirs, assuming Mrs. Whitfield would stay silent, assuming she couldn't fight. But she did, because she respects the law, even when they did not. The truth," he said, his hand on the stack of deeds and maps, "is right here. And the truth cannot be ignored." Clifford's attorney tried one last plea, painting Marjorie as cold, inflexible, unwilling to compromise. But the judge's eyes told the story. The facts had already been weighed, and the outcome was inevitable. Marjorie sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, dignity in every line of her posture. She had fought her fight. Whatever came next, she was ready. But outside those walls, the families of Lakewood Meadows were bracing for the shock of their lives. The verdict hadn't even been read yet, but the weight of the lawsuit was already crushing them. It started with small cracks, whispered conversations in kitchens, mortgage payments that suddenly felt heavier, trust in the HOA evaporating like morning dew. Night after night, Victor and Angela Ramirez sat at their dining table, the letter from Marjorie's attorney still tucked in a drawer they couldn't bring themselves to open. "What if the judge rules against us?" Angela whispered one evening, their kids asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that their home could vanish with a stroke of a pen. Victor stared down at his calloused hands. "Then we fight for compensation," he said quietly. "We didn't build this. We're victims too." For the Briggs family, the weight hit differently. 7 months pregnant, Lauren burst into tears after reading a headline in the Macon Telegraph about the lawsuit. "What if we bring our baby home?" she sobbed. "And then they tell us we don't even own this place?" Tyler wrapped his arms around her, murmuring, "It'll work out, babe. It has to." But the fear in his eyes betrayed the words. At neighborhood gatherings, tension boiled over. The once celebratory HOA meetings had turned into shouting matches. "You told us everything was fine," one homeowner yelled. Clifford raised his palms, his voice tight. "It is fine. This is legal wrangling, nothing more." "Legal wrangling?" another woman snapped. "My entire retirement is tied up in this house." Clifford's trademark confidence cracked. Under the fluorescent lights of the clubhouse, his voice wavered, his shirt damp with sweat. Hanover Construction had stopped sending representatives altogether, leaving Clifford to absorb the anger alone. "My entire retirement is tied up in this house," one woman snapped, her voice shaking with fury. Clifford's confidence slipped. The polished, untouchable leader was gone. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the clubhouse, his voice wavered, his shirt damp with sweat. Hanover Construction had stopped sending representatives entirely, leaving Clifford to face the mob of angry homeowners alone. Some families turned their anger toward Marjorie. One evening, as she walked to her mailbox, a car slowed. A man in a baseball cap leaned out the window and shouted, "You're destroying lives, lady!" The word stung, but she didn't flinch. Later, sitting with Samuel, she admitted quietly, "They see me as the enemy. But the real enemy is the one who sold them false promises." Others, though, began to see her side. At a community gathering, Angela Ramirez stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "She didn't trick us," Angela said, eyes fixed on Clifford. "He did. She's protecting what's hers. And if we were in her place, we'd all do the same." The room fell silent. The divide was clear. Half the community simmered with resentment toward Marjorie. The other half seethed with rage at Clifford. Then came the financial collapse. Banks grew hesitant to approve new mortgages in Lakewood Meadows. Realtors pulled listings, terrified of lawsuits. Property values froze, then began to slide. Families who had stretched every dollar to buy their dream homes suddenly found themselves trapped, staring at walls they might never be able to sell. The pressure cracked marriages and friendships. Tyler Briggs confided in a neighbor, voice low and tired. "She wants to run. I want to fight," he said. "Neither of us sleeps." Darnell and Monica Price, the retired couple who thought they'd finally found peace, felt nothing but betrayal. Darnell, once a calm man, now paced his porch, fists clenched. 30 years with the post office," he muttered. "And this is how I retire, on land that don't even belong to me." Meanwhile, Clifford scrambled for control. He appeared on local TV, his voice rehearsed but brittle. "We're in negotiations," he told viewers. "And we're confident families won't lose their homes." But his words rang hollow. Behind the scenes, Hanover Construction was quietly cutting ties, preparing to leave Clifford holding the bag. The emotional toll was brutal. Children overheard late-night conversations and asked the questions their parents dreaded. "Are we going to have to leave?" one little boy asked as his mother tucked him in. She kissed his forehead and forced a smile. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. But when she closed his door, she leaned against the hallway wall and wept. For Marjorie, the fallout was bittersweet. She had never wished harm on the families, but she knew every brick, every window, every flower bed had been built on land that was rightfully hers. "They shouldn't be angry with me," she told Samuel one night. "They should be angry with the ones who gambled with their lives." Samuel nodded. "And that's what the court will soon make clear. But you should prepare yourself. No matter the ruling, some people will always blame you. Because blaming the truth is easier than facing who really failed them." The families of Lakewood Meadows turned their anger anywhere they could. They hadn't built the trap, but they were living in its jaws. And with each passing day, the anger, the confusion, the fear only grew heavier. But the storm had only begun. The court's decision was coming. And with it, the moment when dreams would either collapse or be rewritten forever. The day of the verdict, the courthouse in Macon was overflowing. People lined the hallways, pressed shoulder to shoulder, while news crews set up outside, cameras ready to capture the heartbreak or the relief. For weeks, the community had been holding its breath. Now, everything would be decided in a single ruling. Marjorie arrived early, walking slowly but with purpose. She wore a gray suit that had once belonged to her late mother, the hem perfectly pressed. Beside her, Samuel carried a heavy binder stuffed with documents, though by now, neither of them needed it. The facts were undeniable. The land was hers. And the trial had made that clear. Still, as she sat down, Marjorie prayed quietly. Not for victory, but for the strength to carry whatever came next. Across the aisle, Clifford Myers looked nothing like the confident man who had once promised everyone that everything was fine. His tie was loosened, his face pale as he whispered frantically to his attorneys. Weeks of testimony had stripped him bare. Homeowners who had once cheered him now stared at him with cold, open resentment. Even Hanover Construction, his greatest ally, had abandoned him, their representatives refusing to appear in the final hearings. Clifford sat isolated, the weight of 96 families pressing down on his shoulders. Then Judge Patricia Long entered the courtroom. Her face was unreadable as she adjusted her glasses and shuffled her papers. When she began to speak, the air in the room thickened. "After reviewing the evidence presented," she said, her voice steady. This court finds that the plaintiff, Mrs. Marjorie Whitfield, has maintained uninterrupted ownership of the disputed property for more than 40 years. Taxes have been paid. Deeds recorded. Title reaffirmed. The construction of Lakewood Meadows on her land, she continued, her tone sharp, was conducted without her consent or knowledge. A ripple tore through the courtroom. Gasps. Whispers. A muffled sob. Judge Long didn't pause. Therefore, the court recognizes Mrs. Whitfield as the rightful owner of the property on which the Lakewood Meadows subdivision was built. The words dropped like thunder. Some homeowners broke down openly. Lauren Briggs clutched her belly and wept into Tyler's shoulder. Victor Ramirez dropped his face into his hands. Monica Price stared straight ahead, her lips trembling, too stunned to cry. To them, it felt like their world had collapsed. But for Marjorie, it was vindication. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and whispered, "Mama, Daddy, we did it." Judge Long's voice cut through the room again. "As for remedies," she said, "the matter of compensation must be determined through further proceedings. Hanover Construction and the HOA are hereby found liable for damages." The room erupted again, reporters rushing for the exits, homeowners sobbing or shouting, and Clifford sitting frozen, as though the floor had fallen out from under him. The judge's final note offered a small mercy. Homeowners would not be immediately displaced, but their residency would depend on what came next, a resolution between the defendants and Mrs. Whitfield. It was legal language for something far simpler. They weren't being thrown out that day, but their futures were still hanging by a thread. At the plaintiff's table, Samuel squeezed Marjorie's hand. "This is a victory," he whispered. "The rest will follow." Outside, chaos erupted. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into faces. Clifford Myers tried to force his way through the crowd, but the questions followed him like a storm. "Mr. Myers, do you have a comment on the ruling?" one shouted. "This isn't over." Clifford barked before ducking into a waiting car, the door slamming behind him. Then Marjorie emerged. The crowd surged forward, questions overlapping. "Mrs. Whitfield, how do you feel about families losing their homes? Do you plan to sell the land back? Are you open to negotiations?" She paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the sun warming her face. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of everything she had endured. "This was never about hurting families," she said. "This was about protecting what belonged to me, and to my parents before me. The HOA gambled with lives that weren't theirs to gamble with. I did what anyone would do, defend what's rightfully mine." Her words held both dignity and sorrow. That night, Lakewood Meadows felt heavier. Some residents turned their fury on Clifford, calling for his resignation. Others directed their anger at Marjorie, convinced she had stolen their stability. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The fault wasn't hers. It lay in the arrogance that had cut corners, skipped steps, and assumed she'd fold under pressure. Inside her modest ranch home, Marjorie placed the court's ruling in her fireproof safe. Then she sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea as if it were just another night. And yet, everything had changed. She had gone up against a system designed to overpower her, and won. For the families, the road ahead was anything but certain. Would the HOA negotiate a buyout? Would Hanover Construction pay damages? Would they be allowed to stay? None of those answers came quickly. But one truth was no longer in dispute. The land was Marjorie's, and no one would ever erase that again. In the weeks that followed, Lakewood Meadows no longer looked like the picture-perfect neighborhood in the glossy brochures. On the surface, the lawns were still manicured. Kids still rode bikes in the cul-de-sacs. Porch lights still glowed at dusk. But beneath it all, the weight of uncertainty hung heavy. Conversations grew shorter. Smiles grew tighter. Every glance between neighbors carried unease. Families scrambled to consult lawyers. Some sat at kitchen tables late into the night, debating whether to walk away entirely. At the Ramirez house, Victor and Angela tried to hold their family together, reminding each other that they'd been misled just as much as Marjorie had been wronged. But the cracks were showing. Their children asked questions they couldn't answer. Are we moving again? Is this still our home? For the Briggs family, the nightmare deepened. With their baby due in weeks, they considered selling, but no one would touch a house tangled in a lawsuit. We're stuck, Tyler muttered one night, pacing the hallway. Paying a mortgage on a house that might not even belong to us. Lauren, exhausted and afraid, leaned against the nursery doorframe, whispering, We just wanted a future. Why is that too much to ask? At the final HOA meeting, Clifford Myers resigned in disgrace. Residents shouted him down, demanding answers. He offered none, only a hollow apology, before walking out to a chorus of angry voices. The man who had once been celebrated for his ambition had become the face of betrayal. Behind the scenes, Hanover Construction quietly reached out to Samuel. They proposed a settlement, a substantial sum in exchange for Marjorie transferring the title back to the HOA. She listened as Samuel explained the offer, sipping her tea in silence. Then she shook her head. This isn't just about money, she said. They need to feel the weight of what they did. Every shortcut. Every assumption. They thought I wouldn't fight, but I did. Still, Marjorie's resolve didn't erase her compassion. She knew the families, the Ramirezes, the Prices, were suffering under a burden they never asked for. And she wasn't done deciding what justice would look like. They hadn't chosen this fight. They were collateral damage. One Sunday afternoon, Marjorie attended a meeting at a local church where many of the homeowners had gathered. The room grew tense when she walked in, the weight of weeks of fear and anger hanging in the air. But she didn't come to argue. I don't hate you, she said plainly. I don't want to see you suffer. But this land was stolen from me. I couldn't just let it go. What happens next will depend on negotiations, but I want you to understand, I'm not your enemy. The people who sold you false promises are. The room shifted. Some listened with softened expressions. Angela Ramirez even stood up and thanked her. Others crossed their arms, their anger still raw. But for the first time, many saw her not as the villain tearing their world apart, but as a woman fighting to protect her family's legacy. For Marjorie, victory had never been about riches or revenge. It was about respect, about proving that ordinary people could stand against powerful institutions that thought they were untouchable. She had preserved her parents' dream, not just for herself, but as a message to anyone who believed silence meant surrender. The lesson was clear. When you underestimate someone's resolve, you invite consequences you can't control. The HOA had built 96 homes on someone else's land, confident they could bully their way through. Instead, they had walked straight into a trap, not out of malice, but out of Marjorie's quiet, relentless vigilance. Weeks later, Marjorie walked her property line with her cousin Thomas. She paused at one of the old iron markers that had been there since her childhood. Daddy told me to never let this go, she said softly. Thomas nodded, his voice thick with emotion. You honored him, Marge. You honored both of them. In the distance, the rooftops of Lakewood Meadows gleamed in the afternoon sun. For Marjorie, they weren't symbols of defeat. They were reminders, proof that patience, persistence, and truth had carried her through. She had been underestimated, ignored, insulted, but she had not been defeated. For the families, the road ahead was still uncertain. Negotiations would drag on. Settlements would be fought over. Some might never recover the trust they'd lost in the process. But even in their pain, there was a lesson. Shortcuts leave scars, and trusting the wrong leaders can cost more than you ever imagined. In the months that followed, Marjorie's story became more than just a lawsuit. It became a parable, whispered across the county and beyond. Yes, it was about land. But deeper than that, it was about dignity. About standing tall when others expect you to bow. Because strength doesn't always shout. And justice doesn't always come quickly. But when it comes, it is undeniable.